So yeah, today I'm just going to start with a preliminary kind of introduction to sexual ethics. I am speaking from a distinctly Christian perspective, and I think all of you assumed that. And there are multiple perspectives on these themes amongst Christians. Um, my own, I forgot to tell you a little bit myself. As you know, I'm a professor of theology. I've been a pastor and a church planter. I've done a lot of different things. I operate in the academic world, and I operate on the ground as well. I've also been someone who's had a keen interest in hermeneutics, which is the discipline of interpretation. And there's biblical hermeneutics, there's philosophical hermeneutics, there's kind of life hermeneutics, there's different approaches. But I've had to work through many issues in my life. One of them was the issue between men and women in leadership in the church. And I didn't start off with a strong view either way, really, but I wanted to be faithful and dig down into that and kind of think about that. I ended up discovering that I'm an egalitarian. And I wrote a blog series about that a little while ago that I might share with you at some point, because it's really focused on, well, I'm an egalitarian, but I know that there are these biblical texts that are difficult to deal with, right? Like First Timothy 2, or Ephesians chapter 5, right? And other places. And so how do you navigate that without just being arbitrary and whimsical? How do you provide a framework where you can interpret consistently? You try to minimize the anomalies and maximize how your interpretive grid sort of is working. I've also had to work through issues related to science and faith, around issues of creation and what is Genesis about. I've worked through several issues in ethics. And so this isn't kind of a unique thing for me, but it's another area where I have a deep interest because it involves a whole range of multifaceted questions. When you're talking about sexual ethics, you have to engage biology and science, you have to engage scripture, you have to think philosophically a little bit. And so it's a complicated thing. So I'm hopefully going to try to navigate us through that without making things too complex. All right. So thinking Christianly about sex and gender. Here's where we're going to be going over our time together in the coming weeks. Sex and contemporary culture is what I'm going to address tonight. Next week, we're going to start talking about gender. And when I mean gender, I mean what's going on with gender identity, and its relationship with, let's say, biology. In week 3, we're going to return to the issue of gender and think through a nuanced Christian response to gender dysphoria, which is the condition that some people face where their biological sex does not seem to align with their internal sense of their gender. And more than that, the dysphoria is really a word about anxiety. Sometimes this produces a great amount of anxiety in people, and it can make life actually very difficult to live and to navigate. And so we're going to look at that from a variety of perspectives and think of a nuanced response for Christians. We're then going to talk about marriage. And so this really gets us into the whole question of like the traditional view of Christian marriage, whatever that is. I think we have some sense of that. I find that actually a lot of Christians don't actually understand the traditional view that deeply, but we kind of assume we do because it's sort of the default in the church. It's kind of like how we think we understand how salvation works, but then if we think about it, it's like, do we really understand Christology and all of these atonement theories and everything? Sometimes it's helpful just to pause and break it down. We'll then look in week 5 at the whole question of same-sex unions in the church. There are a number of churches today that are proposing that we can allow same-sex unions in the church, and perhaps God blesses same-sex unions in the church. And so we're going to consider that and think about that. And I'm going to think about both pros and cons and kind of let you sort of evaluate and see what you think. All right. And then week number 6, we're going to look at the question of caring for LGBTQ persons. Probably all of us, and if not all, most of us, have people in our lives that we love and care about. And so this matters not just in terms of theory. This is like real stuff, right? So we want to address some of that as well. Okay, so sex in contemporary culture. Contemporary culture is difficult. to say the least, right? When we're talking about sex, it is very confusing. There's so much going on, like so much information, so many influences, the various social medias, right? Whether it's, YouTube, or whether it's, I don't know, call it Facebook and TikTok, and I go on and on, right? There's so many different influences. And more than that, there is a fair degree of polarization and disagreement amongst people. I think also, just kind of to step back and to look kind of objectively, I think it's okay to sort of observe that it's quite a confusing mixture of both helpful and, at the same time, some destructive ideas and practices. So we've seen some huge shifts in our culture over the last 20, 30, 40 years. These are actually deep-seated and go back arguably hundreds of years. Though that they feel really contemporary, these shifts have been ongoing for quite a while. And some of the changes have brought about some positive features. Others, as I say, are perhaps destructive. And so it's a real mixture of things. Just to give you an idea of the confusion, and here are just a few things that I've thought of over the last few years. Mixed messages we get about sex, right? That seem kind of positive, but then it's like maybe not so much. So there's this great song. It's got a great rhythm and tune and everything. Meghan Trainor, a lot of you have probably heard this, right? All about that bass. And it starts off with kind of a positive message in a lot of ways, like it's kind of against body shaming and everything, right? Yeah, my mama, she told me, don't worry about your size. Right? Great message for girls, very positive. But then the next line, she says, boys like a little more booty to hold at night. Okay, maybe not so positive, right? Okay, it's like we started well, but maybe this isn't the best reason to not worry about your size. I remember this song became very popular a few years ago. I remember when this song was really at its height, it was like the most downloaded and accessed song, I think, in the world for quite a while. And the lyrics are just so like, interesting. The chorus, I'm in love with the shape of you. We push and pull like a magnet do. I'm not going to sing it for you, sorry. Although my heart is falling too, I'm in love with your body. Last night you were in my room and now my bed sheets smell like you. Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with your body. Part of me is like, what does it mean to say you're in love with somebody's body? Like, what about the rest of them? What does it mean to be in love with the shape of somebody? I like Ed Sheeran, by the way. He's got a lot of great songs, but this one I remember is just like, oh, this just seems so tragic, these lyrics. Remember Jian Ghomeshi, the host of the CBC show Q? He was quite good as a host, very popular, made a lot of really interesting interviews in art and culture, some of them controversial, but always an intriguing guy to listen to. And he got caught up in a scandal at the CBC where it was sort of coming out that he was behaving in ways that women were saying were inappropriate, were crossing boundaries. It went to court. It became a great big mess. And it was a time where, the culture kind of leaped on this, and there was a lot of, social shaming. There was a lot of sort of judgment on Ghomeshi. And you know what? If the allegations are true, then in a way, rightly so to some degree, right? I certainly wouldn't be one to defend the kinds of things he was accused of doing. Very interesting. At the exact same time that the Ghomeshi debacle was going out, and some of it involved things like, S&M, sexual practices, and when does consent come into play, and when has consent been violated? So all that kind of stuff. Really difficult things to think through and think about how to do that. So at the very same time this was going on, the movie 50 Shades of Grey was coming out, and it was marketed as a great Valentine date. And I remember thinking this was just so kind of ironic, because the very thing that kind of gets Ghomeshi into a lot of trouble is in this film sort of being celebrated. And these boundaries are being pushed pretty strongly in terms of, You know, these like, when is consent okay? When does pain cease to be something that's something I want to stay with, and that's pleasurable, to something that I don't want to endure anymore, kind of thing. Confusing, right? Mixed messages in our culture. I want to talk for a few minutes about some deep shifts that we have been observing in culture and worldview. So, when we look at the debates of today and the culture wars, we really are looking in at the surface of things. Uh, but there have been monumental shifts that have been taking place for a long time. If some of you have took the course on ethics with me before, and at one point we navigated a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about ethics, different systems, and we got this picture that, wow, thinking about ethics can be quite difficult, especially if you don't have a worldview that's grounded in something objective. Like, if our ethics aren't grounded in anything beyond ourselves, like something ultimately real, then they can sometimes seem like they're a little bit arbitrary. And sometimes social ethics sort of feels like that. Like, what's it all grounded in? So there are some deep shifts that we've been observing in culture and in worldview. Let me just throw out a few book call outs for you guys. These are included in the resource list that I gave you. And I'm mentioning them because I'm drawing a fair bit from some of these sources tonight. One is a book by Carl Trueman. He's a historian and a theologian, and he looks at trends that have happened really over the last couple of hundred years that have led us to the place that we are in now, in terms of some of the confusion we're dealing with around questions of sexuality and gender. That first book, it's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's really worth reading. It's a bit long, and it's a little bit more on the scholarly side. The one in the middle is one that he produced and published after that first book. It's a little bit more accessible, written for a more popular audience, if you're interested in that. The third book is a really fascinating one. Since I've read it, I've been recommending this to students and to kind of anybody who wants to think about sexuality. It's not focused on LGBTQ stuff. It's more focused about changes in how we think about sex as a culture. She's really focused on the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s. And it's a very interesting book because Louise Perry, the author, is not a religious person, very much a feminist. And her main thesis in the book is that the sexual revolution, by and large, has been a bad thing for women. So I might talk about this book a little bit more as we go through, but I just really recommend it. It's kind of eye-opening. I, reading this book, felt convicted so many times just about assumptions and things. And just, especially coming from a perspective that's not, doesn't have kind of a religious axe to grind. It's really thinking about the well-being of women, and how what the sexual revolution ultimately did was seek to give women sexual liberation and freedom, but really to do that through the lens of male desire and what males are looking for in sexual relationships. And she explores this in some detail. There's a lot of good research in that book, and it's quite readable. So very, very, very interesting. Man, if you've got daughters and if you have sons, I would just recommend this as a book about culture and understanding what's going on. Really, really helpful. So I'm going to name 4 sort of major cultural and historical shifts that have been taking place over the last few hundred years. One of them we could name this way. We have moved from a sacred and transcendent order, we might put it, or framework, to a secular and immanent framework. Okay, so from a sacred and transcendent to a secular and immanent framework. Now, what do I mean by sacred? Well, it used to be the case that, we human beings in the West saw the world in such a way that it was infused with wonder, with mystery, in a word, with God. It was a world made by the Creator. It speaks out his own purposes, right? Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Early scientists like Francis Bacon thought that God spoke through two books, the book of scripture, his word, and the book of nature, his works. And he sought to kind of think about how we might hold those together. And a number of scientists who were Christians and theologians who were scientifically minded really picked up on that two-book metaphor to think about, yeah, we have this world of cause and effect, but that's nested within a larger world of mystery and transcendence where God has created it, he's designed it, and he's present to us in it. He's not absent from it. But more and more, we have moved into what the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls an immanent frame. We kind of lock God out of the picture. We focus not on big questions of purpose, because those are hard to discern from an empirical standpoint alone. Like science just looks at the material world, the physical world, cause and effect, proximate relationships. It doesn't look at ultimate causes or purposes. And it certainly doesn't deal in terms of ethical categories, right? And so the more that we've leaned in our public knowledge on sort of science being the only way of knowing that really matters, and religion kind of more and more pushed out of the frame, we've begun to think of human beings in this kind of immanent frame, disconnected from God. It's a world where we have to decide for ourselves what our purposes are. We are the creator of our own sort of destiny, in a way. So this movement from a sacred frame where God is active and moving, where his purposes for human beings are known, and where to some degree those purposes are built into the fabric of creation. So one of the ways that manifests for humans is that, we used to kind of believe strongly that humans had a very identifiable nature, right? There's a human nature. And along with that nature go fitting ways of being human and unfitting ways of being human, or ways of flourishing and ways of not flourishing, or ways of doing good and ways of doing evil. And we could know that because we would say, well, we're not just inventing this ourselves. We can look objectively to the creator who has designed this and who gives us his guidance. But locked within an immanent framework, right, where there is no transcendence, we are left to ourselves to think about our own purpose. What is our purpose? It's really hard to do any ethics at all if you can't talk about purposes. There's an image that I gave in the ethics class. It doesn't come from me alone. It comes from a philosopher named Alistair MacIntyre. And he says that in the modern world, we tended to get rid of purpose questions and focus more on facts. He says the problem, though, when we do that is that we have no way of making value judgments about these facts if we don't have access to a notion of purpose. One of the examples he gives is a watch. If you don't know that the purpose of a watch is to tell time, you can't really make an evaluative judgment about the watch. Is this a good watch or is it a bad watch? Right? Now, you might make a judgment on that, but your judgment's going to be arbitrary, right? Like I like this is a good watch because it's black, or this is a good watch because it weighs, X number of pounds and it's good for, weighing down the papers on my desk or something. Completely arbitrary. But if you know that the purpose of a watch is to tell time, then you can make evaluative judgments that aren't arbitrary, but that fit its nature, so to speak, right? Now, we know what the purpose of a watch is because we human beings designed it. But what about our own nature, our own purpose? We didn't design ourselves. I just saw a question, a contextual definition of immanent. So immanent is just kind of the opposite of transcendent. So transcendent would be beyond us, right? So not locked within, let's say the material realm. And the immanent realm would be that realm that's kind of a closed-in system in a sense, right? So our universe is in one sense a kind of closed-in system. I mean, not in another sense, but this idea that, there's no divine working within it, that we're really sort of fenced into our own material kind of existence and world. That's, yeah. Taylor defines it in a much more complex way, but that's, that's one way of kind of getting to the gist of it. Yeah, thank you. So we need a sense of purpose, but how do we get to purposes? Science doesn't address the question of purposes. Really, it's worldviews that do that. And what do you base your worldview on, right? Especially when we just don't know anymore, really, because we don't have a common kind of religious perspective any longer. Oh, got to come back on my screen here. A second trend, and it's related to the first, is that we have moved from a shared story, and I've capitalized that on purpose because it's the biblical story, right? And the biblical sort of way of seeing things, to many competing narratives. Many competing narratives. I think many of us are well aware that we live in a post-Christian society. I don't mean that in a kind of evaluative sense. I'm not saying it's good or bad, just descriptively. It's a deeply secularized society. And by the way, I don't think of secularity as something all that bad necessarily. Christians kind of invented secularity, oddly enough, because it was this idea that we're not going to compel people to religious faith, but we're going to create a public sphere where there's religious freedom. And we're going to try to win people over to our views rather than coerce them into our views. Because a coerced conversion isn't a real conversion in an evangelical way of thinking. In any case, we've moved from a shared story to one in which we are seeing competing narratives. We are a multi-religious culture, and increasingly there are people who identify as having no religion at all. Now, we have many who would claim some idea of spirituality, but they're not necessarily linked to any kind of concrete tradition, whether Christianity or anything else. And so we live in a very different time, multiple religious perspectives, multiple secular perspectives, and yet we've inherited common language. This is something Alistair McIntyre, he's the ethicist I mentioned just a little while ago, mentions in his book. He says, we all use the same kind of language as if we're saying the same thing, but our language has become detached from a common story. And so it no longer makes a coherent kind of sense. I shared this image with some of you before in a previous course. It's sort of like, if you think of ethics as kind of a game, like a board game, right? You kind of have to know what the purpose of the game is to know how to play the game well. You need to know what its objectives are. You need to know what kind of game you're playing, like is it a collaborative game or is it a competitive game? And certain games have unique rules. Well, imagine a situation where I gathered 100 different games, board games, card games. I dumped them all on a great big table. And then I took out randomly like 100 pieces at random from this mixture of games to another table. And I sat a bunch of down a bunch of people at the table and I said, okay, go ahead and play the game. And they're like, okay, well, there's dice. We all know what dice are. There's some cards here. We know what they are. So there's commonalities in all these games. But actually, they operate very, very differently. And pretty soon an argument would probably arise in terms of, well, I thought we're doing this, and what are we actually up to here? And I think in some sense, this is the situation we find ourselves in terms of ethics today. We have common language. We have some idea of what people mean when they say something with respect to ethics, but it's coming from different places contextually, and so we struggle to put it all together. Thirdly, and this is something that the article I sent out earlier today from Faith Today talks about a fair bit if you want to check it out at some point. There has been a strong movement away from external sources of authority to internal sources of authority. So external sources of authority would be largely institutions like the church or the government or family or one's particular tribe, right? Or it might be your village or something like that. It's something that comes from outside to constrain the individual and to really tell them sort of what their place in the whole is. We've moved away from that to more internal sources of authority. In other words, what seems true and authentic and relatable to me? Sometimes our values simply reflect our personal preferences because we don't really know what to ground them in objectively. So, inner feelings and subjective thoughts have come to sort of predominate in terms of how many people think about what's most real in terms of reality. Here's a couple of quotes from that article. This is by a guy named Sam Reimer, who's a sociologist who works out in New Brunswick. He says, among more recent generations, external authority is increasingly suspect. No longer are parents, priests, pastors, and politicians assumed to have the right to tell me who I am, what I should believe, or what I should do. I am expected to find my own truth, to discover who I am, to find my own path. I am my own authority. The locus of authority is now inside me, not outside. He continues, to be clear, this shift is not because younger generations are resisting conformity to the world, nor are they necessarily more discerning. Rather, they are conforming to a cultural message that tells them they are an original, so that no one can tell them what they should do or be. They have to follow what their own heart tells them. Their journey is unique to them. The culture says each person must find their true self, and society presents them with more options than ever. And he goes on and he sort of lists a bunch of these different ways that we are to seek our own uniqueness, our own truth, our own inner reality, which then we can form the other outer reality too. So much more, people think in terms of my own inner feelings, my subjective thoughts determine reality, rather than some external objective constraint calling me to conform my inner world to it. And then one more trend is the trend away from things like duty or nature. It's very hard to talk about human nature today because it's believed that any definition of human nature would be inherently oppressive. Because once you define human nature, you make certain things normative, like for everybody. So then you make other things non-normative, and then that can be oppressive. The trouble is we need some notion of human nature, though, because as I said before, if we can't think about human nature, we can't think about our purpose. If we can't think about our purpose, then we can't make non-arbitrary ethical judgments about what's right and wrong. So it's a bit of a conundrum there. But we moved away from like duty. Duty sort of something that's imposed on me from the outside, right? Or the order of things. And we stress much more strongly personal authenticity, what resonates with who I really am inside, and what many have called expressive individualism. That what's most real is what's inside me, and what it means to be authentic is for me to express that out in the world in a variety of ways. So like many, let's say in our grandparents' generation or our great-grandparents' generation, would have thought of themselves very much as having a place in society that was more or less given. They would seek to conform to that, and they would have a strong sense of duty that this is my role, right? I'm called to this because this is my responsibility. Today, it's not that that's completely gone, but in terms of the pendulum swing and the emphasis, it's much more about, well, no, if I'm conforming to duty and nature in the order of things, that's inauthentic. That's not me, that's the system, or that's the world, or that's them, right? I need to express myself, and that's being true to myself. And that's what's most real, and that's what is most ethical. I just want to say this situation produces a fair bit of ambiguity. Okay, so it's not all bad, and it's not all good. Let me just mention some positive things about these shifts. Women's rights, right? We've moved from a certain way of conceiving the order of things, where let's say only men could vote or only men could have positions of power, whether it's in the public world or in the home or the church, to embracing a wider view of men and women together as human beings serving in their gifts, right? I mean, that's a bit of a spiritual way of putting it, but More public way would be to assert the importance of women's rights, and that's been a real gain, I think. Also, in general, we have been much more clear, especially in post-World War II era, to articulate human rights that give teeth to how we're going to protect the freedom of people, particularly those who are marginalized or oppressed or discriminated against. And that too is a positive development. We also have a strong reaction against perceived hatred, right? Sometimes I think we can be a little judgy because we think that people that disagree with us, hate us. and maybe sometimes they do. But this is positive that we are able to name that hatred is not a good thing. God's a God of love, to put it in Christian way of speaking, and he opposes hatred. We are not to hate. We're not even to hate our enemy, never mind our neighbor, right? We're to love. A stress on protecting marginalized groups, also positive. And specifically with respect to sex and gender, I think there's much more of a positive movement today, away from focusing on shame, right? From shaming those who don't conform to the norm. And I just mean norm in the sense of the average here. I don't mean that ethically necessarily. Okay. And this is a big change. And remember, this is not just in the church, right? Go back to like 1980s comedy, watch some Eddie Murphy or some Jim Carrey or anybody really. And there's an awful lot of prejudice and shaming and down talking of gay people and other sexual minorities, right? So it's not just in the church, but the church certainly participated in it. And I think it's been good that the church has repented. Where that's happened, there's still a lot of ways to get, a lot of room to grow. But where the church has repented of its true hatred of others, or bad joking, or mocking, or shaming, or looking down on self-righteously people that aren't like them. And then recognizing too, I think, with the emergence of democratic forms of government and increasingly kind of egalitarian ways of operating, recognizing the non-coercive nature of God's relationship with creation, that God actually grants us freedom. And if God gives us freedom to respond to him, maybe we shouldn't coerce others, right? With over heavy-handed means to force them to believe what we believe or practice what we want to practice, right? And so that's a positive development in Western culture. As I say, secularity, or a certain kind of secularity, is actually a Christian idea. I don't mean atheistic secularity. I mean a secularity grounded on this notion that other people have brains that God gave them, and we want to create space for them to think things through and for us to debate and argue rationally rather than coerce each other. Some harmful and destructive trends. There's a lot of confusion today, and there's a lot of cynicism about truth and morality in general. This goes all the way back to people like Friedrich Nietzsche, who's had a strong influence on postmodern culture. And Nietzsche believed that all claims to truth and morals are just veiled claims to power, right? All claims about truth and morality are claims that the powerful make, or the elite, or those who are wealthy and successful, in order to kind of justify the status quo of things and keep other people in their place. Now, there's some truth to that criticism, but I think it's a reductionist criticism, because if we don't have any truth or any morality, we are in deep, deep trouble, right? But in our society, this has become we become so cynical about this that, this just feeds the polarization. It's like anybody who has a different view than me must have an ulterior motive, and it must be self-serving, right? And they're probably evil and so forth. That's a deep, so there's a lot of suspicion, a lot of cynicism in our culture about these things, and it makes it really, really hard to talk with one another. I think another problem with some of these trends and how they've manifested is that when we've moved away from a sacred picture of things to an immanent frame, we lose sight of the specialness and the uniqueness of human beings, right? You and I, we ain't nothing but mammals, right? Nothing but. And as animals, right, we behave like animals, right? There's nothing special or unique about us. So why would we hold ourselves to some kind of lofty ethical ideal or something? Now, these things aren't always consistent, because I think really we do believe human beings are special. Like, how could we have human rights if we didn't believe that? But we downplay this at the same time by saying that actually we're just the product of random chance. There's no real value to us over against the rest of creation, and so forth. So that makes it hard to sometimes think about ethics. When it comes to sex and gender, we really can't have these conversations without stopping to consider the impact that pornography is having on a wide level on how people see, how they experience, how they desire, and what expectations they have about sexuality and about gender. I don't even think we understand the extent to which this is shaping us, and it's shaping a new generation. I've read many times now that the average young person is less sexually active than young people were 20, 30 years ago, but is probably seen thousands of breasts and vaginas and penises and whatever, right? I mean, it's kind of scary, the number of people who have not experienced a first kiss, but have seen very graphic sexual acts over and over and over again before they ever have any actual real experience. And this pre-shapes what they think they want, and it pre-shapes what their expectations are. I remember as a student at university, I once wrote a paper on the correlation between pornography viewing and date rape, because there's a lot of sort of violent porn. There's a lot of porn in which it's depicted as, somebody might say no, but no means yes, right? Kind of stuff. And this having an impact on how people think about sexuality, especially men. They get false expectations about what women want, what's actually pleasurable, and what might actually be, harmful, and so forth. Very, very sad. The book that I mentioned to you on by what's her name again? Louise Perry. She delves into this a little bit as well. Also, a rejection of all sexual boundaries. Now, I know we wouldn't maybe say that we do reject all sexual boundaries, but actually, if you try to argue for any particular one and try to do that in a kind of objective way, you'll encounter people that will say, wait, why that one? It's actually hard for us to come to common agreement on this. And perhaps what we have come to agree on is the notion of consent. That what seems to really be crossing a line is when someone else doesn't consent to a sex act. But there are issues with consent as well. I'll talk about those a little bit later. Oh, sorry, I see there's a comment or a question. By the way, I didn't mention this, but just due to the nature of the subject matter, if anybody wants a question that they don't want to be, public, you can send me a private message and I can just read it, without saying your name, okay? A paraphrase quote I often remember on the topic is, "A young man now can see more graphic sexual experiences in a day than King Solomon saw in his entire life," right? And he had like, what, 800, 900 wives or something? Imagine that impact. Yeah, exactly. Well said. Another harmful and destructive trend is the exploitation, objectification, and commodification of women. It happens to men and boys too. But women get a particularly bad deal on this. Again, I'm going to point you to Louise Perry's book. I can't recommend it enough. It's so important. Exploitation, right? That we exploit, that we objectify, and then we commodify women's bodies, and even parts of women's bodies. I'm just going to point to a video, and I'm going to send this to you. Excuse me. It's just very short. It's only about 4 or 5 minutes long, but it's quite provocative. It's by a woman named Jean Kilbourne, who does a lot of work on the depiction of women in media and advertising. And just when you see this video, it's heartbreaking, and it's also like it's just arresting. And my goodness, women and young girls are just subjected to so much, right? There are so many teenage girls that don't want to be teenage girls because of so many of these influences. Now, that's not the only reason. That would be to oversimplify. But when you think about this, it's profound in its impact. So I just want to give a shout out to this, and I'm going to share that link with you later. It's a fascinating little clip. Be great to show in like a small group or something to talk about how media influences our view of others. I want to mention too some questionable trends. Like these are kind of, we could put them out there for debate. Like, are they good? Are they bad? You know, it might depend on your worldview, where you're coming from. A collapse of traditional values, right? So these might be family values, values around church and religious adherence. It might be values about family and how much my family can tell me who I am versus how much I tell my family who I am. And these can be very cultural, right? Like, let's say if you're from an Asian culture, then the sense that society gives you a place is much stronger. There's a stronger collectivist push. In the West, we have a very strong individualist push. And I just want to say, these are not just Christian values that are collapsing, but all traditional forms of value are collapsing. Sex is thought of as being removed from biological and reproductive constraints. One of the major impacts on how our views of sex has shifted is contraceptives, and particularly the pill. And so writers like Louise Perry, as well as others, there's another woman writer in the list of resources I gave you, talk about this a fair bit in terms of just how much of a bombshell this was. Because what this allows is for us to disconnect sexuality from reproduction. And once you do that, you can remove it from long-term relationships. And so you can now have much more casual sexual encounters. You can remove sex from commitment, from responsibility, and you can remove it from sexed bodies even, right? So sex might be not just a male-female act. It might be same-sex. It might be group. It might be individual. There might be a whole range of things that once we remove the sex act from biological and reproductive and familial or family constraints, it just changes the entire nature of how we think about sex. And I include this as an ambiguous comment because, again, there have been positive things in terms of this trend, and probably some harmful things that have come from this. This is true of all technologies, by the way, right? Like nuclear technology has allowed us to develop whole new wings of hospitals to do things like MRIs and scanning technologies and things, right? And at the same time, we can build bombs that can destroy unfathomable amounts of, people and regions and even the earth, right? Technology is always a double-sided sword. And so in the same way, we Protestants like to sort of down talk Catholics for being so against contraceptives. More and more have begun to say, maybe they had a point on some of this. Even if we don't want to go all the way, maybe we didn't really think through what we might put in place of these constraints that we've just jettisoned. Also, sex now is thought to be much more central to one's identity than people would have ever thought of in the past. Carl Trueman traces this trend to the work of Sigmund Freud, who made sex a central part of identity, and then repressing those sex desires as something that we wrestle with. Now, he argues that, Freud's ideas largely have been discredited and discounted, but this basic insight about sex being central to our identity has persisted and just grown in a post-Freudian kind of era. Sex positivity, helpful or harmful? I don't know, have you heard of the slut walks that were popular a little while ago? It's kind of like this idea that we take something that's a negative, we embrace it and own it and turn it into a positive. But then does that owning actually encourage, let's say, women to embrace sexual freedom that actually turns out to be sexual enslavement, right? So how much sex positivity is truly for our flourishing and how much of it opens up to potential harms? It's just a legitimately ambiguous kind of a thing. Probably both in some ways. And then I want to point out a little bit of moral confusion, right? Well, if you really sit down and think about it, more and more, is any particular sexual behavior evil or taboo at all? Is anything absolutely right or wrong? Or is there always a time and a place for something? Is there any such thing as sexual perversion? Is there such a thing as sexual immorality? And is do no harm sufficient? So everything is fine as long as I'm not harming someone else. Is that sufficient for a sexual ethic? Of course, we then have to ask, well, what really is harm, right? And this gets you into that Jian Ghomeshi, 50 Shades of Grey conundrum. Is the notion of consent sufficient? What constitutes consent? What's the duration of consent? Like when let's say you're in university, you go home with somebody, like what do you do? Do you get the consent once? Does it have to be out loud? Do you have to keep doing it every 5 minutes? More and more, it's even been suggested that people actually write down contracts before they sleep together, so that it's fleshed right out, right? But in a situation where sex is something that's casual, I mean, these things which sound silly really do become problematic. The problem of power. I don't know if any of you have watched The Morning Show, Apple TV, but the character played by Steve Carell gets himself into a fair degree of trouble. He ends up sleeping with a colleague. And from his perspective, like she came willingly, she enjoyed it. Like, what's wrong? What happened, right? Well, she felt coerced because she was under him. And even though she didn't say no, the whole thing was this power dynamic. And it raises this whole question of whether consent was really there or not. Okay, I'm going to wrap up in the next minute or so. But I just want to point to the fact that, yeah, Scripture actually does talk about sexual immorality. And it does actually a fair bit. I posted a list of scriptural texts, and these are just from the New Testament, so not even counting the Old Testament, that relate to sexual immorality. And there's 2 pages full of these texts. Some of them are from Jesus, both the Gospels and in the book of Revelation, and a number of them are from Paul. But we get a lot of, and then from people like James and Jude and others. But sexual immorality is not a minor concern in the New Testament. In fact, James, in the book of Acts, when the Council of Jerusalem meets to say, oh, what are some things that, we don't want to put too many constraints on Gentile believers. Like, we don't want to have to make them become Jews to be Christians. So we don't want to overburden them with too many rules. But one of the 2 rules they did give them was to avoid sexual immorality. Carl Trueman argues that the framework for identity in wider society today is deep, rooted, powerful, and fundamentally antithetical to the kind of identity promoted as basic in the Bible. And maybe that's not so shocking because very few people attend church today. Even amongst Christians, biblical knowledge is at an all-time low. Theological and historical knowledge is even lower. And what we might call a kind of biblical worldview is just not that common, even amongst evangelical Christians. The Barna Group has done research on this recently. Okay, I want to close with some theological convictions that I think should guide our discussions moving forward. So I'm just going to list these. I'm not going to explain them too much. But this helps you to know, again, how I think we need to say these things up front so that we're framing our approach to sexuality and gender well. First of all, I want to acknowledge the human dignity possessed by every single person on earth, without exception, because every person is made in the image of God. Nobody should be hated or mistreated or violently assaulted or made fun of or joked about. Nobody should be, because when you do that to them, you're doing it to Jesus, right? When you've done this to the least of these, you've done it to me, Jesus says, right? So we respect the dignity of others because they belong to God and he loves them no matter what. That's the second one, an affirmation of God's love for all people. And correspondingly, our call to love all neighbors, and specifically all kinds of neighbors. And Jesus uses the example of the hated Samaritan to just drill the point home that your neighbor is not somebody just like you, but actually someone who might be quite different from you, opposed to you, even seen as dirty or unclean by the majority of your group or society. We're to love. Now, how do we love? That's a big, big question we're trying to sort out. How do we do that well? But we cannot cast into doubt the call to love and to really show that forth in embodied ways. The biblical narrative, and we'll come back to this, but I'm just going to mention it now, that the Bible, it's got a really nuanced view of our experience as human beings. Sometimes we want to just say, well, everything's good, or we react and say, well, everything's evil, right? The world's just going to hell in a handbasket, or whatever. The Bible narrates a journey that God creates, and everything God has created is good. That includes our bodies, it includes sexuality, it includes the material world, it includes you and me, it includes everything that we are. At the same time, the Bible narrates that everything is broken. Everything's been distorted by the fall into sin. And the point of the fall is not that everything is as bad as it possibly could be, but that everything is touched by it. There's nothing that remains unaffected by sin. And so we have to talk about brokenness. We have to talk about distortion. We have to talk about how things go off the rails and how this is not for our flourishing. And then thirdly, we have to talk about how God enters in order to redeem all of this and to restore our dignity and to direct us toward his new creation. This applies to sex and gender and marriage. All three of those are created, they're good, they're also distorted and fallen. One of my gay Christian friends, Wesley Hill, has said to me, he says, people talk about, gay sex being distorted or fallen or whatever, but heterosexual sex is distorted and fallen and really problematic. And absolutely it is, right? We all know that. Or at least we should know that. We experience that in our marriages and our own journeys. So fallen, and God is also acting to redeem all of these things. There's a correspondence here with the life of Jesus, that the incarnation of Jesus affirms our embodied existence. The crucifixion calls us into question and judgment, and the resurrection calls us forth into new possibilities where God miraculously redeems us, heals us, and leads us forward in ways we might not have expected. And then finally, I just want to highlight the call toward obedience and holiness in the New Testament. We all have to ask the question, what does redemption, repentance, and holiness look like in the realm of sex and gender? We believe in salvation and that salvation is by grace, but as we learned in the previous course, salvation has both a basis, right? We have a right to be included simply because God loves us and has died for us, and that's it. But salvation also has a goal. It's toward something. And all over the New Testament, that goal is identified as us being conformed to the image of Jesus. And as part of that, Jesus calls us to his kingdom gospel. Repent and believe the gospel, Jesus says, whenever he preaches the gospel. The kingdom of God is at hand. And so along with this comes an allegiance to Jesus as the king And that means having an allegiance to his word and being obedient to his word. As Jesus says in John 10, those who love me obey my teachings. So trying to hold all of this together, I think, is an important way to frame everything we need to talk about with nuance and care.